This is a video response to Cosmic Skeptic's video responding to the argument for motion with respect to Ben Shapiro's video. Cosmic Skeptic explains the argument for motion and why potentiality is necessary to explain change. But I kind of think there are more convincing reasons and reasons which will kind of explain better what potentiality actually is. So I'm going to go into that here first and just kind of explain why potentiality, why do we need that for change, and more broadly, what is potentiality and why do we need it in general. So the first thing you have to recognize is that for Aristotle, change is continuous. There's a whole long discussion of this in Aristotle's books on the physics. So you can go there if you want a full explanation, but basically the reason is going to be because time is a measure of change and time is continuous. After all, let's say we have two measures of time, right? What exactly would be between these two? So if it's not continuous, there has to be something between them, right? But it doesn't really make any sense for there to be anything between two different times other than two more times. So just from that kind of intuitive notion there, you can see that it doesn't really make sense for there to be any non-time gaps. So time, clearly, it needs to be continuous. In addition to that, Aristotle is going to argue that continuums cannot be composed of indivisibles because indivisibles do not have parts. In order for a continuum to be composed of indivisibles, so let's say we have a timeline and there are indivisible points, right? Just supposing. And this timeline goes like this, and it's just composed of infinite number of indivisible points. Well, in order for there to not be any gaps between these points, each one of these points would have to be touching, right? That's what it means for them to be continuous, because if they're not touching, there's something between them. And what else is going to be between them other than more time? So, if they touch, then they're going to have to be either touching by a part. So, for example, and then we have another circle right next to it. Okay, so they're going to be touching. If they're continuous, they have to touch by the left and the right side, right? Or they can be touching by a hole. Okay, but what we've said already is that they can't be touching by a part because they don't actually have parts. They're not composed of parts. So they have to be touching hole to hole, kind of like that, right? But if they're touching hole to hole, then they can't really form a continuum because they are transposed over each other. So for this reason, Aristotle said that, well, if there is a continuum, it has to be composed of parts which are touching by a part, which means every unit of time or any continuum is going to have to be further divisible into more parts ad infinitum. Likewise, since Aristotle believes that time is a measure of change, the change must also be infinitely divisible. In other words, you'll have a kind of continuum from x to y. X is the starting point of change and y is the ending point of change. The continuum of change itself will be infinitely divisible. So no matter how you divide this up, whatever section you take of the continuum, there will be change within that section, according to Aristotle's theory. This is also important for Aristotle's solution to the paradox of the arrow, where you have an arrow and it's going from X location to Y location, right? Zeno's going to say that if you take any sort of moment in the arrow's trajectory and you just take that moment, in that moment, the arrow will be not moving. And so, in a sense, the arrow is both moving and not moving at the same time, since this supposes that the motion is composed of immovables, right? Aristotle doesn't fall into this problem because there are no immovable moments within inside of Aristotle's time. Every single time is going to have an arrow moving, right? Change per se has to be continuous. And so there must be a continuous change from X to Y. That means the change from X to Y are divisible infinitely into sections of change. Now the problem comes when we try to say what the X and Y are. If I say X is, let's say, not hot, and I say that Y is hot, then we have a change from not being hot to being hot, right? The problem is that this looks a lot like a change from not being to being. And between not being and being, there's nothing, according to the law of the excluded middle. Everything is either being or not being. So it seems that it's impossible to have a continuum between not hot and hot. Thus, the change from not hot to hot must be instantaneous and not continuous. That means it cannot be the kind of continuous change by which time is measured. Now, just to be clear, you can still map out indivisible motions such that we begin at t1 and end at t2, but it has to be per accidens, right? The indivisible quote-unquote motion presupposes some kind of continuous change that we're measuring the indivisible motion against, the motion of a clock, for example. A bit of a side note, but this is important when we're talking about the argument for motion. Aristotle argues that everything which moves is divisible because we can always divide their movements into smaller motions. If an indivisible moved, on the other hand, it would have to have a smallest motion, which is going to be equal to itself, since nothing is smaller than an indivisible, right? But someone might object that it seems coherent for someone to talk about indivisibles moving according to an invisible motion, which is true in a sense, in a per accidens sense. An indivisible can, quote unquote, move in an indivisible motion only depending on something which is moving per se in a per se sense, by which we can measure that change. So if we look at a clock, we see at one time this is not being, and then at another time this is being, for example. Right? But this is going to be depending on that which moves in a per se sense, by which we can measure that change. And that which moves in a per se sense will be infinitely divisible, since it won't have a smallest amount of motion that it's moving by, right? So it will depend on its parts for its motion, and for this reason, everything in motion depends on another, according to Aristotle, right? Now, that's all a side note, but since this video is about the argument for motion, I wanted to note that. Anyway, if change were from not being to being, for example, not hot to hot, then there couldn't be any continuous change, since there is no between not being and being, which simply means there cannot be any change at all. On the other hand, if X is being and Y is being, right? So in other words, if X is hot and Y is hot, just cross out hot, right? and it doesn't seem like a change occurred at all, right? It's not possible to go from hot to hot. Hence, Parmenides concludes that since you cannot go from not hot to hot in a change, like an actual per se change, or hot to hot in a per se change, therefore change is impossible, right? So how do we solve this? Well, it isn't strictly true that change is from not being to being. And this becomes more clear when you use more concrete examples, right? So if we talk about coffee, for example, going from not hot to hot, the starting point is not pure non-being, rather it is a cold cup of coffee. So we're going from a cold coffee to a hot coffee. And the cold coffee, okay, we could still analyze that as being not hot, but rather what we should do, according to Aristotle, is we're going to say that being is divided into potentiality and actuality, right? And so what this actually isn't just not hot, but it's potentially hot, right? It's the capacity to receive heat. And this capacity is continuous. So the change can also be continuous. Father Garrigou-Lagrange, in summarizing Aristotle's response to Parmenides, puts it this way: that which becomes and tends towards a determinate end comes neither from nothingness nor from already determined being, rather from undetermined being, capable of receiving a given determination or perfection. Men call this a real capacity for receiving perfection passive potency, just as they call the capacity for producing the same perfection active potency. The perfection itself is called acts, and hence you see that being is divided into potency and act. And do you not see at the same time that potency is essentially ordered to act? Passive potency to the act to be received, and active potency to the action to be produced. As the power of sight to the act of seeing, or the power of hearing to the act of hearing. You cannot move from not being to being, but you can move from potentially being an act to actually being an act, since potentiality is continuous and can receive actuality continuously. It's not pure non-being. It's an ability or capacity to receive being in a limited way. Hence, for example, you cannot move from being not hot to being hot, but you can move continuously from being cold to warm to hot. That is, the potential to be hot can be actualized continuously. And sure, going from not hot to being hot will be instantaneous because that's just the completion, right? That's the completion of the change to being hot, but not going from cold to hot. That will be continuous. There's another part of Parmenides' view that the denial of change doesn't capture, and that is his monism. Monism is the idea that everything is one. Parmenides thought that because outside of being is nothing, there is nothing by which different beings can be differentiated. Suppose we have two beings, and by beings I mean something that exists, right? Both of these are the same in that they're beings. So we need another feature to differentiate them. Now, with respect to this example here, obviously they're in different spatial locations, right? Which implies they have different matter. But suppose that's not the case. Suppose, these are actually in the same locations and everything is exactly the same. We can't really call them two different beings if they're the same in every single way. We need something to differentiate between them. So I don't know, let's put an X in this one and then a line in that one, right? And so now you can actually differentiate between the two of them. So, but could we actually just add a feature to being itself, right? To differentiate two different things? Parmenides is going to say no, because outside of being is nothing, right? So we can't really add anything to being to make them different like we did here. Because in this example, like obviously we don't have just pure being itself, we have two squares. But it gets the point across. You can't, if we're just starting with pure being itself, right? We can't add a feature to it and differentiate them that way. So Parmenides concludes that since you can't add anything to being itself to make multiple beings, that therefore being must be one, and there can't be any difference between them. So we are stuck, even if we, want to affirm not only change, but multiplicity of beings whatsoever. Because as I said, change is going to be going from one thing to another, right? And you can't go from one thing to another if being is one. And you also can't have multiplicity of beings if being is one, right? So the Thomistic solution to this, at least as exposited by Norris Clark, it's going to be, instead of having something in addition, we're going to have being, let's say these two are identical, and then we're going to have different limitations around being, right? Different limited ways of receiving being. And so one is going to be limited in one way, and one's going to be limited in another way. And that's going to be how we're going to differentiate between them, right? Outside of this, we can think of it like this. Outside of this, there is nothing. But within being, there is something. And between being and non-being, there is this limit, which makes these two different beings different from each other. As Norris Clark put it, every real being, save perhaps one, must be constituted by a real metaphysical composition or real inner structure or complementary polarity of two correlative metaphysical co-principles within the unity of one being, namely one, an act of existence by which it actually exists, is actively present to the universe of real beings, and two, a limiting essence by which it exists in this or that particular mode of manner of existing, as this or that particular being and not some other. The whole being, in order to describe like the whole beings as in creatures, right? You're going to need both the being of the creature and the limiting, what's called an essence that defines what the creature is. And those two correlative principles are going to be what makes a whole being, right? And so this is what is meant by, that earlier quote where it says, act and potency divides being. You need these two different principles for a whole being to exist. The whole being doesn't exist without being, and it doesn't exist without the limitation on being, right? These two work together to form a whole, complete being. In other words, these are not two separate substances. So what does this have to do with potentiality and actuality? Well, if you think about it, a limit's not going to exist without what it's limiting. The limit or essence is in potentiality to being. which explains, of course, why we think of creatures as being contingent. In themselves, they may or may not exist. So this is a sort of middle position that accepts Parmenides' claim that outside of being there is nothing, because technically the limitation isn't outside of being, it's a limitation on being. It's sort of like saying that, well, the limit of a circle is outside of a circle. I mean, not really. The limit is sort of a part of circle. It's on the edge of it, right? But this limitation is not merely a limitation on static being. It's a limitation on how creatures can act, right? It's how they potentially can act. Thus, an eye acts towards the end of sight due to the fact that it's an eye, and the act itself is due to the existence of the eye, but the fact that this act of the eye is of the eye kind, that is a seeing kind, is due to the limit or essence or the nature of the eye. And so, as you can see, there's a sort of teleology inherent within this nature of potentiality.
The first problem that I have with this is treating potential as if it's a real quality of an object. To avoid thinking of change as something coming from nothing, we imagine that this hot coffee really has this thing, this potential to become cold. Potential is thought of as a real property of my coffee.
So something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing.
But consider this. My coffee has the potential to be lots of things. In fact, it seems to have the potential to be an infinite number of things. For example, my coffee is currently around 70 degrees Celsius, and it has the potential to cool down to 60 degrees Celsius. It also has the potential to be exactly 60.1 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.11 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.111 degrees, and so on, ad infinitum. Now, a great deal of religious philosophers and non-religious philosophers believe that actual infinites can't exist. For example, this is the basis of William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. If an infinite number of things really exists, it leads to all kinds of paradoxes.
He's suggesting here that within creature, there has to be an actually infinite number of potentials, but I think this is the wrong way to think about it. First of all, yes, in a sense, there's an infinite potential for change. But like I said, potentiality isn't actuality, but is a limit between actuality and nothingness, right? In this case, it is just the limited ability to receive actuality. A better way to think about this is as potentiality being a continuous capacity to receive actuality up to a limit. Suppose you have a coffee cup, for example, right? This coffee cup has the potential to receive coffee right up to the top here, right? This is its capacity for receiving coffee. But it doesn't seem that you need like a separate limit. If we're thinking about coffee cups, if we're thinking about potentiality as a limit, it doesn't seem like we need a separate limit for it to fill up halfway with coffee, right? The limit being the full capacity of a coffee cup seems to be sufficient to explain the halfway point of being filled with coffee. It just follows from the fact that the coffee cup has the capacity to receive a full cup of coffee, that it has the potential to receive half a cup, because the potentiality is continuous. So we shouldn't think of it as being composed of like these actually infinite number of potentials to receive coffee. I don't think. I think the way you should think about it is a continuous but limited ability to receive coffee, or potential in general. To think of it as a continuous but limited capacity to receive actuality, and that's enough in itself to explain the ability to receive half of the actuality without needing to have separate potentiality to receive half of a cup of coffee. A similar point is true with heat. There's a maximum amount of heat a coffee can receive before it boils away, and that maximum capacity, the limit, is sufficient to receive less than that maximum. If I draw a circle, I've drawn a limit, but I haven't drawn an infinite number of limits, right? And yet the limit seems to be enough for me to only color in a fraction of the circle, right? The limit being continuous, the limit of the circle, like the potentiality of the circle, comes from the limit and the continuum of the capacity to receive an infinite amount of color actualities.
A second problem is one that was raised by the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy while he was discussing this very argument with Ed Feser himself, something that you can watch on the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel. Oppy simply grants that change is the actualization of potential, but he points out that the reverse is not true. Not all actualization of potential is change. He provides the example of a chair, like the chair that I'm sat on right now. Now, this chair is yellow. This chair has the potential to become blue, say, if somebody were to reupholster it. But it also seems to have the potential to remain yellow. That is, things that are actual seem to have the potential to simply remain as they are. If they don't have this potential, then they wouldn't be able to remain as they are, and so they would stop existing. And therefore, actual things will always have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as they are. The God that Ben is talking about has to be something that has no potential whatsoever. But as I've just argued, unless God is about to stop existing, he must have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as he is, to remain in existence. So the purely actual God with no potential that Ben thinks he's proven may not actually be able to exist at all.
So in a sense, this is true. Just to think about, again, the limit of essence being in potentiality to existence. At every moment the creature exists, there will be the potentiality of its essence being actualized by the actuality of existence, right? But just because this is true of creatures doesn't mean that it would be true of God, since what we're going to say is that God's essence is identical to existence. So there's no limit on God's existence. He just is the existence without the limit. So there's no potentiality in God in this way. And the existence God has is also unreceived. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about God having this continual capacity to receive existence throughout time. In other words, God is just pure existence itself without limitation, right? There's no potential for God to exist in the future because God necessarily exists. Also, God's existence is the same now as it will be tomorrow, since it is pure existence itself. It cannot be differentiated for the same reasons we explained above. God exists in all times, but there's no difference between God existing today and God existing tomorrow. That's why we call God timeless, right? And it's also another reason why talking about God's potential for existence is incoherent. There's no difference between God existing now and God existing tomorrow. God doesn't exist within this kind of succession of time, because if there were a difference, then you would need a limitation to differentiate between the two. You need to, for example, have T1, God in T1, and God in T2. That would be a limitation of God being in T1 and a limitation of God being in T2. You can't have that if God exists.
Finally, my third objection is that the argument from change may only work on an A theory of time. The A theory of time posits that the present is all that exists. The past and the future, in other words, don't exist. There's just the present. The B theory of time, on the other hand, posits that the past and the future both exist just like the present does, and that they all exist in one big time block.
Okay, I don't accept a non-realist account of change. So my approach is one of common sense, direct realism. And change is one of those things that's clearly apparent to us. You can see my video on man's knowledge of reality to learn more about why I take this approach. That said, as Cosmic Skeptic noted earlier, all potentiality is not necessarily change. And since we need potentiality to even differentiate between different creatures, the mere existence of multiple beings is enough to prove the existence of potentiality. Even if we denied common sense and claimed there is no change, there would still be an actualization of potential, because in itself, essence, or the limit, is potential with respect to existence. So while you may get around the argument from motion technically by denying the existence of change, you wouldn't get around the existence of God. Really, the argument for motion is just one of many ways of showing creatures are indeterminate with respect to existence in themselves. So I think that should clarify some things regarding your objections. I pray that this video helps guide you closer to the truth. Thanks for watching.